Lyndon took me out, and my sister insisted on tagging along. We ran into kidnappers, and they pointed a gun at my sister, holding her hostage, demanding money from Lyndon. I'll never forget the look in Lyndon's eyes at that moment. His eyes were filled with worry as he said to the kidnappers, "Can you take someone else as the hostage? She's pregnant and can't handle the stress." He then looked at me and said, "Ingrid, I'm sorry, she's carrying my child. You take her place." 6 months later, I came back from the kidnappers, heavily pregnant. Lyndon lost it. Whose child is that? I thought I knew Lyndon well. We grew up together, after all, and our families had arranged our marriage. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that one day, he'd tell me my 19-year-old sister was pregnant. And then he asked me to take the place of my pregnant sister as the hostage. I stared at him, dumbfounded, and asked, "Whose baby is my sister carrying?" Lyndon pressed his lips into a thin line, refusing to answer. Even the kidnappers laughed. "I can tell whose baby it is." One of them lit a cigarette, gesturing at Lyndon. "So, who's gonna be the hostage?" Lyndon turned his head away, avoiding my gaze. I felt like I'd fallen into an icy pit. I never imagined the man who always said he'd marry me, the Lyndon who cherished me, the one who treated me like I was precious, who never looked at another woman. Now, he was looking anxiously at my sister, telling her to be careful not to hurt the baby. Then he turned to me and said, "Ingrid, I promise I'll get you out of this. Just bear with it for now. The baby is innocent." He then told the kidnappers, "Take her as the hostage, and I'll leave with the other woman. Otherwise, you get no money." Tears blurred my vision. Lyndon's handsome profile, the one that used to captivate me, now looked cold and heartless. "Lyndon," I said, my voice trembling, "I'll go as the hostage." Honestly, I had no other choice. Lyndon's eyes held no trace of affection anymore. All the love he had for me had shifted to my 19-year-old sister. I sniffled and asked, "But could you at least tell me when you and my sister started this?" I closed my eyes, struggling to remember. "Was it that time I fell and called you, and you said you were in a meeting, but I could hear you panting? Or maybe it was on my birthday when you had those red marks on your neck, and you told me they were mosquito bites, but wouldn't let me take a closer look? Or was it on my mother's death anniversary, the one you used to accompany me to every year, but this year, you disappeared for 12 hours and didn't answer any calls?" "There were so many times I should have suspected you," I said, hitting myself on the head. "But I never did. Not once did I doubt the childhood friend I grew up with, the man I loved with every fiber of my being. Not once did I think he would betray me. That he would sleep with my sister. The sister who had been brought back into the family. My sister is my dad's illegitimate child. It was her existence that drove my mom to her death. After my mom passed, she and her mother moved into our home. From that day on, my dad stopped being my dad, he became hers. He gave her the finest jewelry, the best houses, and poured all his love into her. He said to me, "Ingrid, don't be upset. Natalie grew up without a father, while you had both parents. I'm just trying to make up for my past mistakes." He seemed to forget that she was the illegitimate one. Growing up without a father was normal for her. I watched as he donated to her university, arranged a place for her there. I watched as he transferred shares of the company to her. I watched him shower all his fatherly love on this sister. And then she moved in with her mother. Her mother slept in my mom's bed, wore my mom's jewelry, and went out for tea with my mom's old friends. I came to truly understand what it means when people say out of sight, out of mind. Even the servants started treating me differently. But I thought Lyndon would never change. Lyndon used to hold me in his arms and say, "Don't worry, once I marry you, all these people will come groveling at your feet, including your stepmom and sister." Back then, I truly believed Lyndon and I would last forever. But then my sister would faint in front of Lyndon, time and again, from her frail health, getting cuts on her forehead but refusing to cry out in pain. She'd act like a scared little bunny, pointing at the luxury brands I wore and asking Lyndon what they were, saying she'd never seen such things growing up poor. She'd show the scratches on her arms, then hurriedly cover them, eyes red, only to break down in Lyndon's arms after he pressed her. She'd cry, telling him how she was bullied as a child without a father, how she developed depression and couldn't help but hurt herself. At first, Lyndon's hands were stiff, unsure where to go. But eventually, they softened and gently patted her back, comforting her. Just like now. They were embracing, without even looking back, disappearing from my sight. As if it was confirmed, I wasn't coming back. I watched Lyndon's back as he walked away, and a sharp pain shot through my chest. "Lyndon, is this your final decision?" Lyndon said nothing. He just held my sister tighter and quickened his pace until they vanished from view. I was utterly heartbroken. I turned to the smug-looking kidnapper and asked, "So, where are you taking me now?" He smiled and lit a cigarette. "Hostages don't get to ask questions." At that moment, the stars flickered in the sky, reflecting in his eyes, beneath his baseball cap. Those narrow eyes were filled with coldness. I thought I was going to die. But I didn't expect to survive in the hands of the kidnappers for over 6 months. Until the police finally found us and rescued me. The kidnapper laughed as he was arrested, giving me one last look. In that moment, his narrow eyes were filled with amusement. And I went back home. What greeted me was my sister, heavily pregnant, my stepmother, my father, and Lyndon, with an unreadable expression. When he saw me, Lyndon took a step forward, staring straight at me. "Ingrid." My sister wiped her tears. "We've all been so worried about you. We couldn't eat or sleep. We've all lost weight." "Oh, really?" I couldn't see anyone who looked thinner. Except for Lyndon, he did look worn out. Lyndon gently touched my shoulder, his voice hoarse. "You must have gone through a lot." I subtly shrugged my shoulder and took a step back. "Don't touch me." Lyndon's eyes darkened. "Ingrid, I know you blame me. But I hired a detective, mercenaries. I searched everywhere for you." He said, his voice strained, "I thought you'd be okay. I thought if I wired the money right away and hired people to find you, you'd be safe. I didn't expect you'd be gone for so long. I've been in agony every day these past 6 months, Ingrid. I hate myself." I couldn't help but laugh. "You hate yourself? Do you hate that you slept with your fiancé's sister or that you didn't wear protection?" Lyndon froze. He'd never seen me like this before, sharp-tongued and unfiltered. I was always taught to be proper, so much that I felt like a doll. I'd never even said the words "wear protection" out loud. Lyndon's lips tightened. "I know you hate me." I shook my head, walking past him. "Don't flatter yourself. I want you to stay away because I'm pregnant. Don't touch my child." "What?" Lyndon froze. A few seconds later, he forced a smile. "Ingrid, you're joking, right? Where would you even get pregnant?" He stopped mid-sentence. Maybe he finally remembered. He had left me in the hands of a dangerous man for over half a year. Lyndon's face darkened, and he paced nervously. "Ingrid, tell me this isn't true. I can't accept you being pregnant." I sat on the couch, staring at the antique porcelain plate my mom had collected, the one she said would be part of my dowry. Now, it was holding my sister's favorite candies. I chuckled. "Why are you so surprised? When you turned your back, didn't you know what the consequences would be? You can't accept that I'm pregnant? But when Natalie's pregnant, do you think I don't have thoughts about it?" I raised my hand, dumping the candies into the trash, and took the plate upstairs. "You better not touch my mom's stuff." Just as I was about to go upstairs, my dad finally reacted. "Wait. Explain yourself, how did you end up pregnant?" My stepmom chimed in, "Yes, exactly. The plate isn't worth this fuss. Put it down and tell us about the baby first." I stopped, turned around, and calmly explained, "It's the kid I had with the kidnapper." "Who else could it be?" Then, I pointed at my sister. "Why is it that she doesn't need to explain her baby, but I do?" My sister touched her belly. "Sis, it wasn't intentional. Lyndon and I were caught up in the moment. But now that I'm pregnant, what else can we do?" She stared at the plate in my hand, a faint hatred in her eyes, as if I was the one who took something from her. "At least my child has decent parents. Your baby's father is. And what about mine?" I smiled at her. "My baby's father is the best man in the world." Crash. the sound of something breaking. Oh, it was Lyndon. He had accidentally knocked over the tea table and shattered a cup. His face was pale, and he looked at me quietly. I used to always say Lyndon was the best man in the world. I said it all the time, from when we were kids until now. But it was Lyndon who pushed me into the abyss. Now that I've crawled out of that abyss, the man in my heart has changed. Yet now, Lyndon seemed lost. I couldn't understand it. Isn't this all thanks to you? I headed upstairs to my bedroom, but when I opened the door, I almost thought I had walked into the wrong room. The entire place was bathed in magenta. Magenta bedsheets, magenta curtains, magenta lampshades, magenta dressing table. It was a color I would never use to decorate my room, yet it was now everywhere. This was no longer my room. It was my sister's. She's the only one who would love magenta this much. I sighed. When my mom passed, it took less than 3 days for her bedroom to be completely redecorated in the orange my stepmom loved, furniture and all. Even the nanny who had raised me, who merely whispered that the new decor didn't have the elegance of before, was fired by my stepmom. Now, the same trick was being used again, and I had no place to stay. My sister followed behind me, saying, "After I got pregnant, I needed more sunlight, so I moved into your room. Do you want me to move back?" My dad shrugged it off. "What's there to fuss about between sisters? Just let her have your room." I closed the bedroom door. No, I'd rather not. Seeing things that disgust me makes me want to throw up. I turned and headed downstairs. "I'll stay at a hotel." My dad froze for a moment. I'd never defied him like this before. Usually, I'd just cry silently. My sister, on the other hand, choked up, "Sis, I told you, if you don't like it, I'll move back." I frowned, stopping in my tracks. "Then move. Isn't it obvious I don't like it? Can't you tell?" She stood there, dumbfounded, forgetting to let her tears fall. I gestured toward the door. "Go on, move out. I'll wait right here." I used to have a good temper, never getting angry with anyone. I thought it was a sign of good upbringing. But someone once told me that being too nice is just enabling people to walk all over you. That someone was Reagan. He once stroked my hair and said, "Promise me, never let anyone bully you again, okay?" I had promised him. So now, I stood there, arms crossed, in the hallway, watching my sister's tear-filled eyes and listening to her sobs without saying a word. She said she'd give me my room back. But instead of waiting for her to act, I waited for my dad to intervene. "Your sister has been staying in that room for so long. Moving her out would be too much trouble. It would take forever to pack up." He pointed to the room across the hall. "Just sleep in your sister's old room." I looked where he was pointing, my sister's former room. Above the bed hung a massive picture of her and Lyndon, and on the wall, there was a wedding photo of my dad and stepmom. They expected me to live in that room, surrounded by those pictures day and night. If this were the old me, I'd have gone half mad already. I looked at the man who now seemed like a stranger, my father. When I was little, he treated me like a princess. He used to say I was his everything, and everything he had belonged to me. But family bonds change quickly. I turned and walked downstairs without a second thought. "I'll stay at the hotel." Behind me, my dad shouted, "We still haven't discussed what to do about your baby." I heard him curse as I walked away, "It's just a room. You can't even make a little concession for your sister. What did your mother ever teach you, such a petty girl?" I stopped. "Curse me all you want, but why bring up my mom? The woman who stood by you when you had nothing and endured countless hardships?" I turned back and narrowed my eyes. "If I were you, I'd tell your daughter to start packing. By noon tomorrow, she's moving out." Without waiting for a reply, I walked out, ignoring his shouts as I left this house. This place could no longer be called a home. As I walked through the grand front gate, I heard footsteps behind me. Lyndon had followed. He grabbed my arm. "It's just a room. Do you really need to move out over this?" I looked up at him. "What's it to you? Who are you to me?" Lyndon froze, but still held on to my arm. "This baby, it's a lie, right?" Annoyed, I pulled an ultrasound scan out of my bag. See for yourself. Hurry up, I've got a car coming. Lyndon recoiled, as if the paper were something dangerous. He tightened his grip on my arm, hurting me. I winced, pulling away, and called a car on my phone. Lyndon stood pale next to me. Ingrid, how did this happen? His pain baffled me. Isn't this what you wanted? The ex-girlfriend, out of the picture, pregnant with someone else's kid, never getting in the way of your true love again? Lyndon took a deep breath, shaking his head. I didn't want this. He rubbed his temples. Since you went missing, I've been a mess. That's when I realized you actually mean a lot to me. Stop. Save the drama. I cut him off, annoyed. My car's here. I got into the car. As I closed the door, Lyndon grabbed it, his voice urgent, almost desperate. Ingrid, can't you just get rid of this baby? It's killing me. I sat inside, looking at the man in front of me. He looked worn out, red veins in his eyes, lips tightly pressed, clearly anxious. But why hadn't he felt this way earlier? I pried his fingers off the door, one by one, smiling as I asked, what right do you have to ask that? Lyndon, who are you to me? My brother-in-law? Lyndon fell silent. I finished pulling his hand away and closed the door. Lying on the hotel bed, I thought about my bedroom that had been taken over. It was the best room in the house, with the best light and view. My mom had designed it herself, from the curtains to the flooring, from the bed to the sofa to the vanity. Every detail was a reflection of her love for me. Now, it was all taken. I looked out at the dark night, remembering how someone had once told me a story in the dead of night. That was the second night after Lyndon abandoned me, leaving me to follow the kidnappers into the mountains. He said his name was Reagan. He handed me a piece of bread. Stop crying, it's just a man taken by another woman, right? At that moment, I was so heartbroken that I forgot to be afraid. Through my sobs, I said, it's easy for you to say. Do you have any idea how much pain I'm in? Reagan smiled. With a cigarette between his lips, he sat down beside me and looked up at the night sky. I've never had to fight for a man, but I've had to fight for bread. He held up the bread in his hand. I was homeless on the streets back then. Hadn't eaten in a week. Someone gave me this loaf out of kindness, but it was stolen from me. If I couldn't get it back, I'd have starved to death. In my first 23 years of life, I had never heard of such a life story. I was so shocked that I forgot to cry, listening silently as he continued. I was terrified, too. I wasn't even an adult yet, and the guy who stole from me was huge. I hadn't eaten for a week, because he kept stealing my food. I knew I couldn't beat him, but I didn't want to die of hunger, and I couldn't let him rob me again. So I jumped on him, latched onto his back, and bit his ear. No matter how he slammed me against the wall, how dizzy I got from the blows, I didn't let go. There was only one thought in my mind at the time: I had to survive. I was stunned, completely forgetting about Lyndon, and eagerly asked, and then? Reagan tore off a piece of chicken and chewed on it, his narrow, attractive eyes narrowing further with a smile. Well, between the two of us, I survived. After that, no one dared to steal from me in that area. He pointed at my bread, signaling me to eat. Since then, every time I eat bread, I think, who cares if someone tries to take it from me? As long as I'm willing to fight, I'll make sure they never try to steal from me again. That night, Reagan finished his bread and left. I looked up at the night sky, deep in thought. Then, I took a big bite of the now cold bread in my hand. Now, 6 months later, as I stare at the sky again, I suddenly realize I want some bread. Before ordering delivery on my phone, I casually sent a text to my dad: get my bedroom back to its original state by noon tomorrow, or I'll sell all the shares Mom left me. 2 seconds later, my dad started blowing up my phone. I didn't answer any of his calls. I put my phone on silent, went to sleep, and waited for the next day to check my room. All of my mom's shares had been left to me. My dad had gone crazy over this, staying out late for nights on end. But my mom, even on her deathbed, made sure all the paperwork was done. If I liquidated those shares, while it wouldn't bankrupt my dad's company, it would definitely cripple it for the next 5 years. When I didn't pick up, he texted, "You used to be such a good girl, remember?" You're breaking your dad's heart. Yeah, I used to be good, and that's how I lost my bedroom, my dad, and my fiancé. This time, I've decided not to be good. When I didn't reply, he sent voice messages, each one a full 60 seconds. I played one, it was him cursing at me. I immediately shut it off and started searching online for how to liquidate shares, sending the screenshots to my dad. He stopped cursing after that. A few seconds later, he sent a message, "Come at noon tomorrow." The next morning, I got up early and went to see Aunt Pamela. It had been a long time since I last saw her. Aunt Pamela was a major shareholder in my dad's company. Back when my dad had a financial gap and was desperately seeking investors, no one was willing to help. It was my mom who befriended Aunt Pamela and convinced her to invest. Over the years, they had become close friends. But in her final days, my mom was deeply unhappy and didn't want to see anyone, so Aunt Pamela didn't know what had happened between my parents. By the time she found out, my stepmother and half-sister had already moved in. As for me, my dad kept such a tight leash on me that I wasn't even allowed to take her calls. Thinking back, I was really weaker than a piece of tofu. If it hadn't been for the kidnapping, the life and death situation that made things clear to me, and if Reagan hadn't shown me another way to live, I might have just been bullied to death with no one to care. When Aunt Pamela saw me, her eyes immediately welled up. "Your dad didn't let you contact me, did he?" I nodded. For the first time since I returned, tears streamed down my face. It was time to settle some scores. At exactly noon, I walked into my bedroom and couldn't help but marvel. All my beautiful decorations, the simple, elegant bedding, even the flowers and the chaise longue on my balcony had been perfectly restored. I turned to my dad and nodded. "Well done. I guess you're really afraid I'll liquidate my shares." My dad's face darkened, and my stepmom tried to smooth things over. "Ingrid, what are you saying? You're being so ungrateful. Your dad was even thinking about throwing you a cleansing banquet to get rid of all the bad luck." I was casually admiring my freshly manicured nails, but at this, I raised an eyebrow. "A cleansing banquet?" I stood up. "Sure, I'd love to attend." I glanced at my dad. "So, you're throwing me a banquet, huh? No wonder you haven't even looked at me since I got back after being kidnapped for half a year. You were planning a surprise." My dad's face grew even darker, and he opened his mouth as if to say something. But when he saw my sarcastic smile, he gritted his teeth and nodded. He shot my stepmom a glare, probably annoyed that she was stirring things up. My stepmom likely didn't expect that the once quiet and submissive Ingrid would now take every opportunity to push things further. But just wait. There are more surprises to come. I glanced down at the bracelet on my wrist. It didn't look like much, just a silver bracelet, clunky, with a rough design. But because it was so plain, no one had noticed the rare emerald set into it. Reagan had given it to me. He had carefully placed it on my wrist. "Tomorrow you'll be back in the light. Go fight, go grab, go bite, and take back what's yours. Then stand on top of them and look down." He had given me this bracelet, a precious heirloom from his father, something he hadn't sold even when he was starving. He placed it solemnly on my wrist. I stroked the bracelet and urged my dad. "What's the hold-up, Dad? Can't figure out who to invite to the banquet? I can help you think of someone." I called Aunt Pamela. "Aunt Pamela, my dad's throwing me a cleansing banquet. Could you help me with the guest list? Or maybe you could invite people yourself? The more, the merrier." My dad's face turned a deep shade of anger. "Ingrid, are you out of your mind? You don't even know who the father of your baby is, and you still have the nerve to show your face in public." I pointed at my sister. "And how do you feel about her baby?" My dad was speechless. My stepmom jumped in again, trying to smooth things over. "What's done is done. There's no point in holding grudges. Why not just accept the reality and move on? Your sisters, after all." I smiled and nodded. "I never said I wouldn't accept it. Lyndon? I'll gladly gift him to Natalie. I don't want him. But the banquet must happen." My dad glanced at my phone, where the call screen was still open, showing the name of a well-known securities broker in the city, a close friend of Aunt Pamela. He was an expert at handling stock liquidations. My dad clenched his teeth and nodded. Having achieved my goal, I didn't want to stay there any longer. I locked my bedroom and headed downstairs. My sister followed behind, silent but her gaze filled with hatred. But just as we were about to reach the first floor, she suddenly asked, "Sister, you said you don't want Lyndon anymore, that you'll give him to me. Is that true?" I waved my hand dismissively, as if trying to swat away a fly. Who would be hung up on garbage? If you want it, of course I'll give it to you. You two are a perfect match. Just as I finished speaking, I heard a cough. Lyndon was standing downstairs, his posture straight, chin slightly raised, but his pale face gave him away. There were many people at the homecoming banquet. Pretty much everyone in the city's social circle had been invited by Aunt Pamela. When my dad threw my sister's 19th birthday party, it was the talk of the town. Half the business community came. There were towers of champagne and cake, and on the spot, my dad gifted her a mansion, diamonds, and a car. Now, my homecoming party was even grander. Aunt Pamela had insisted on my dad hiring a party planning team known for their lavish and extravagant style, famous for how much money they could burn. I knew my dad felt the pain of every penny spent. When it came to spending on my sister, he never batted an eye. But when it came to me, he was stingy. Still, I held on to my shares, and I got him to give me a wardrobe budget. Top-tier couture dresses and jewelry were all set up. On the day of the party, I wore a golden fishtail gown, paired with a necklace and earrings of the finest sapphires. My hair was styled in vintage waves, and my lips painted a striking red. As soon as I stepped out in high heels, the room went silent for a moment. Then, low murmurs filled the room. Is the older daughter of their family really that beautiful? Why do they always praise the younger daughter and never mention the older one? The younger daughter's a classic beauty, but the older one, now that's stunning. I bet on the older one. I walked gracefully through the whispers, stopping in front of Lyndon. He looked at me quietly, a flicker of amazement in his eyes. "Ingrid, I never knew you had this side to you," he said, his voice low as he glanced at my red lips. I smiled and held out my hand to him. "May I have this dance?" A hint of excitement lit up in his eyes. "Of course." My sister bit her lip and called out softly, "Lyndon, I'm not feeling well." But Lyndon didn't hear her. A man who can abandon his fiancé's life at gunpoint can hardly be expected to remember an old mistress when faced with beauty. He pulled me into the dance floor, moving in rhythm with the music. "Ingrid, I've missed holding you," Lyndon murmured in my ear. I smiled and silently mouthed, "Don't talk," spinning with him, watching as his gaze grew more and more dazed. So this is the man I've loved for so long. Resting my head on his shoulder, I whispered, "Can you tell me about your family's investment in the southern part of the city? You know my current situation, I have no one to rely on. They say you can't depend on others forever, and if I could make money myself." Lyndon smiled. He leaned in and said, "Sure. You can learn whatever you want, as long as you keep smiling at me." When the music stopped, Lyndon and I separated and left the dance floor. My sister's eyes were red, looking pitifully at Lyndon. But Lyndon didn't see her, because Aunt Pamela was tapping her glass. "Everyone, I have a request," Aunt Pamela said, actually more of a decision, "that I'd like to announce." She pointed to me. "This is the daughter of an old friend of mine and the heiress to the group. We shareholders have watched her grow up, and I was also close with her mother. After some discussions today, we've decided, as shareholders, to suggest she join the management team for training. If she's going to inherit the family business someday, we want to be confident in her abilities." The room fell into stunned silence. I smiled as I walked up to Aunt Pamela and thanked her, then looked down at my father's bewildered expression, and my sister's resentment. Back then, my sister had wanted to join the company, but she didn't want to start from the bottom. She wanted to jump straight into a general manager position, but Aunt Pamela and the other shareholders shut that down. Aunt Pamela said they couldn't trust someone like her in management. But now, I, the neglected daughter, was being strongly recommended by her. I looked at my stepmother's furious eyes, practically shooting fire, and gave them an even brighter smile. Well, what can I say? When my dad had nothing, it was my mom who stood by him. The shares my mom left behind could really hurt my dad. And the people my mom helped him network with, they had the power to intimidate him. It's just a shame that, like me, my mom never thought to use the resources she had. Soft music played in the banquet hall, and in the midst of my father's anger, I laughed freely, danced, and socialized, doing things the old, introverted Ingrid would never do. I became the most dazzling presence of the night, keeping Lyndon's gaze locked on me. My sister was shaking with rage, tearfully complaining to my dad. But Aunt Pamela had a brief conversation with him, and after a moment, he sighed and nodded, gently pushing my sister aside. Across the dance floor, I watched the commotion. I raised my glass to my sister and took a sip of grape juice. She stared at me for a moment, then suddenly walked over. As she reached me, she slipped and bumped into me. I stumbled, and my sister exclaimed loudly, "Oh no, I'm so sorry, sis. I didn't mean to. Your baby, is it okay? The first 3 months are the most dangerous." The banquet hall fell silent. People started whispering, "Ingrid's pregnant? Whose is it? I don't know, but she has been missing for 6 months. So, did she disappear to have the baby? How come no one heard about a wedding?" I shrugged, listening to their gossip, treating it as background noise, but in my mind, I thought of the baby's father and his mischievous, bright eyes. Back then, I cried almost every day, nearly blinding myself. At first, Reagan had barked at me to stop crying, but when he realized he wouldn't hurt me, I cried even harder. Reagan sighed and handed me a tissue, then, after a while, scratched his head. "How about I just send you back? The ransom's already been paid." I shook my head. I wasn't crying because I'd been taken by Reagan. I cried because I truly had no home anymore. My mother was gone. My father had become my sister's father. And Lyndon? Lyndon belonged to her too. I had no one left. So what was the point of going back? I had no home. No matter where I went, I was drifting. Reagan watched me cry in silence for a while, then, curious, he asked, "You've hit rock bottom, how come you haven't cursed anyone out to let off some steam?" Through my sobs, I replied, "A girl should always have manners. No matter the situation, some words should never be spoken." Reagan was stunned. Then, after a moment, he burst out laughing. "No wonder they've taken everything from you, your home, your father, your man. They didn't leave you a thing." Furious, I glared at him, but he just wiped my tears and told me a story. It was a simple one, really: 2 friends, one well-mannered and cultured, the other sharp and flexible with his morals. The cultured one started a company using his own patented invention, made money, and generously helped his friend without holding anything back. But his friend stole the patent, sold it to a competitor, and made his first fortune. The cultured man followed the rules his whole life, never imagining that such foul play could exist, and eventually died from the anger. His wife abandoned their child, leaving the poor boy to roam the streets. Meanwhile, the friend lived a charmed life, cheating, making money, even losing his wife didn't stop his success. Reagan handed me a tissue. "So, do you want to die with your manners intact, or do you want to live and turn things around? It's your choice. If you've made up your mind, I've got nothing better to do. I can teach you, it'll be something to pass the time." I clutched the tissue in my hand and lay awake all night, thinking. My mom had manners, but she died in anger. I had manners, but I was abandoned. And the man in the story, even his child was dragged down by his righteousness. By dawn, with red eyes, I went to find Reagan. I want to live and turn things around. I want every bad person to face the consequences they deserve. As the banquet wound down, my dad, my sister, and my stepmother could no longer keep up their smiles. Only Lyndon kept his eyes on me the whole time. He watched as I laughed freely, danced without restraint, and moved from one conversation to the next, holding a glass of grape juice. He saw me become the undeniable focus and queen of the entire ballroom. When the banquet ended, he walked over to me just before my sister could approach him. "May I have the honor of taking you home?" he asked. I smiled and nodded in the face of my sister's resentment. "You may." The night air was cool, gently stirring the tips of my hair, and Lyndon was mesmerized. He opened the car door for me to get in. I remember when we first met, he would always open the door for me. But after that, he never walked alongside me again, he was always ahead, and I had to jog to keep up. He never opened the car door for me either, not even once. I got into the car and waved at my sister, who stood behind us. "Get home early, and take care not to catch a cold. After all, your belly's bigger than mine." Lyndon glanced at me in silence. A few kilometers later, he glanced at me again. "I remember you used to depend on me a lot." "Yes. I used to be a pampered rich girl, clumsily learning how to make bento from the internet, carrying it to Lyndon's office as a love token. Only to be met with his cold rejection. He said, 'I don't want to see you at work. It affects my efficiency.' But looking back, that was around the time my sister got pregnant. She was home every night, so when exactly did she get pregnant?" I glanced at Lyndon's side profile. Still sharp and cold, just like when he rejected me. But when he rejected me, he got my sister pregnant at his workplace. I pressed my lips together in a smile. I used to be so indecisive, but someone later taught me how to be strong and independent. As I spoke of that person, my lips curved into a sweet smile. That smile seemed to hurt Lyndon. He slammed on the brakes and stopped the car, staring at me in the dim light of the street lamps. "That man, wasn't he a criminal? Why are you smiling so happily when you talk about him?" Under the yellowish glow, he looked at me and sighed. "Are you trying to make me jealous? If so, you've succeeded." "No," I interrupted him. My smile grew even sweeter. "He's the best man in the world. You'll never understand." In the car window's reflection, I could see my own face, my eyes curving with light, and my red lips moving as I spoke the sweetest words, each one like a knife stabbing into Lyndon. "I love him. Very, very much." A suffocating silence filled the car. You could hear a pin drop. Lyndon's eyes were filled with deep pain. "Don't say that, Ingrid, I'm begging you." He rubbed his temples. "I've heard about something called Stockholm Syndrome, where hostages develop feelings for their captors. It's a sickness, Ingrid. Let me take you to see someone." He was like a man desperately grasping for straws, making excuses to convince himself that I didn't love Reagan, that I was just sick. I kept smiling, watching his lips move and his throat bob, not denying, not confirming. Because deep down, I knew what the real sickness was. The real sickness was cheating with your fiancé's sister and leaving her to face the barrel of a gun. The real sickness was staying by a broken wife's side through hard times, only to bring home a daughter from an affair when it was time to enjoy life, ultimately driving the wife to her death and mistreating the child she left behind. The real sickness was not being satisfied with stealing the fatherly love of the first wife's child and wanting to steal love as well. The sickness is in them, not in me, not in Reagan. But I don't say this. I just watch them perform. And when I think the performance is over, I'll tear down this twisted stage once and for all. Lyndon kept pressing. "He must have forced you to get pregnant, right?" "Ingrid, I don't care about that, but I keep thinking, if I hadn't let you go back then." I chuckled, too tired to argue. He wouldn't believe it anyway. And if we're talking about force, Reagan did force me. But he forced me to do something else. Things that made me suffer, but also made me stronger. He forced me to accept his training. He said that when your body is strong, your spirit becomes fierce too. He taught me how to fight, shoot, track, and evade being tracked. He even taught me how to hunt. That boy who once fought to the death over a loaf of bread grew up on the cruel streets and eventually became a mercenary. After seeing him hunt, I realized how rare his gentleness was the day he took me back to the mountains. When Reagan hunts, he's the most ruthless creature at the top of the food chain. Watching the coldness in his eyes, seeing him battle wild animals, and training with him, I suddenly realized that all the things I had cried over before weren't really that big of a deal. They weren't even worth my tears. So I swore to myself I would never shed another tear again, never let myself be weak again. But in the last month before Reagan and I separated, I still cried. I dreamed of my mother. She smiled at me and said she was finally at peace and could leave now. No matter how I called out to her, she never looked back. I woke up, sobbing, and threw myself into Reagan's arms when he came running to check on me. His body stiffened for a moment before he held me close, softly humming a lullaby to comfort me. That was the night I conceived his child. A child I was more than willing to carry. I joined my father's company. I chose a project in collaboration with Lyndon's company to follow up on. My father didn't like it, my stepmother and sister liked it even less. But Lyndon didn't mind. He specifically requested that I handle it, so my father had no choice but to swallow his objections. He talked to me privately. "Daughter, I know you've been through a lot, kidnapping, pregnancy. You've been shaken, but deep down, you're still the same good girl, right? Don't upset your sister, she's about to give birth." I smiled, stood up, and whispered in my father's ear, "No. People change. The quieter a person is, the more determined and irreversible they become when they finally decide to act. That's why people say you should never provoke the quiet ones." But my father didn't understand that. Lyndon and I frequently worked together, often holding meetings late into the night. My sister used to be so understanding, always playing the innocent, good girl role. But as Lyndon and I held more meetings, as we started having dinner and coffee together, as he even drove me to the hospital for something as minor as a cold, my sister snapped. She confronted Lyndon in a huge argument, and from what I heard, he kicked her out of his office. My sister asked me coldly, "Are you satisfied now?" I whistled while reviewing my documents. "We're just getting started, my dear sister. What goes around comes around." She sneered. "Don't forget, I'm carrying Lyndon's baby. All you've got in your belly is some bastard child." I calmly put my papers aside, stood up, and looked at her. "Didn't your mother ever teach you how to speak properly?" I picked up my coffee and casually poured it over her head. "Do you even know where the child in your belly came from? How dare you talk to me like that?" My sister screamed and tried to back away, but I held her in place. I grabbed some napkins and wiped her face. Her face turned bright red with anger. "Wiping my face won't help. I'm going to tell Lyndon what you did, and he'll..." Before she could finish, a hard slap landed on the face I'd just wiped clean. I'd only wiped it because I didn't want to get coffee on my hands. She clutched her face, too hurt to say anything, and ran out, sobbing. After all, I'm a woman trained by Reagan, and my slap isn't just for show. I meticulously cleaned each of my fingers with a wet wipe, feeling a bit impatient. Why should I waste my time and energy on these parasites? Why should Reagan be locked up for a kidnapping that was all part of a setup? I narrowed my eyes. All the grudges and grievances should come to an end. I started visiting Lyndon's office more frequently to discuss projects with him. Sometimes, after finishing our business talks, I would linger, chatting casually with Lyndon while listening to him discuss investment decisions in the southern city with his subordinates. I would make him coffee and bring some snacks. "I want to learn from you. If I could learn even half of what you know, that would be enough for me." Lyndon smiled gently. "Ingrid, how did I not realize how adorable you are before?" In fact, he forgot that for the first 10 years before meeting my sister, he constantly praised me for being cute. But since my sister arrived in the past few years, he selectively chose to forget me. I became a hostage to shield my sister from disaster, no longer the girl he vowed to cherish. Yet, Lyndon did teach me a lot. He explained every decision in detail and predicted the strategies of our competitors for me. I absorbed it all eagerly, memorizing everything word for word. To outsiders, it seemed like Lyndon and I had rekindled our relationship. My sister and stepmother were both in a panic. But my dad surprisingly didn't help my sister. I guess it was because Lyndon had brought in 2 projects, which silenced him. You see, as long as there's money to be made, even if Lyndon plays around with both of his daughters, he can still collect his earnings without a care. The intimacy between Lyndon and me lasted for a week. One day, he called me and asked me to come to a private hospital. I thought he was sick and wanted me to visit him, so I reluctantly asked my secretary to arrange a bouquet of flowers for me to bring along. But when I arrived, I found out that Lyndon had taken me to the obstetrics and gynecology department. I certainly didn't think Lyndon was kind enough to want to help me with my prenatal checkup. I took a step back and threw the flowers on the ground. "What do you want?" Lyndon looked at me with a fervent gaze. Ingrid, I want you back. I don't want to continue this ambiguous relationship. He glanced at my slightly rounded belly. I want you to belong to me again. Although I had been disappointed in Lyndon before, I never expected to be even more disappointed. I looked down and touched my belly. So you want to hurt my child? You don't even want to discuss it with me first, trying to go ahead with your plans? Lyndon looked troubled. Ingrid, I can't let you fall into Stockholm Syndrome, not knowing your true feelings. I've hired a psychologist for you. But this child cannot stay. He reassured me, in the future, I will have new children with you, children who will be better than this one. I covered my mouth in shock. My child was very understanding. Since I became pregnant, I had never felt nauseous. But now, even my unborn child seemed to be disgusted. I covered my mouth and rushed outside, unable to hold back my urge to vomit. But Lyndon blocked my path. Ingrid, you should have the surgery before you leave. Be good. If you want a child, I can give you one. We can get rid of this criminal's child. I steadied my breath, desperately trying to suppress my urge to throw up. I told the baby in my belly, just wait a moment, mommy needs to hit someone first. My hand turned into a fist, and I quickly calculated in my mind. The plan was almost ready. I could stop now. I looked up at Lyndon and asked seriously, who gave you the right to say my partner is a criminal? Lyndon opened his mouth, but before he could speak, I punched him in the face. Blood gushed from his nose. He looked at me in shock. Ingrid. I followed up, and who gave you the right to say my child is the child of a criminal? I swung another punch at him. But Lyndon, having practiced martial arts since childhood, was prepared this time and dodged my blow. I grabbed his tie and wiped the blood from my knuckles. Lyndon, think twice before you speak next time. Don't be so overconfident. You're not money, why would I like you? Lyndon pressed his lips together, the corners of his mouth drooping slightly, his voice hoarse. Ingrid, what's gotten into you? You'd rather have a kid with a kidnapper than give me a chance. Yes. I couldn't be bothered to give you a single chance. And soon, I'd make you regret messing with me. As I walked out of the hospital, I decided it was time to wrap up my plan. I drove home, entered my dad's study, and dismantled the listening device hidden under the desk. Then I went to the company and, under the guise of being part of the management team, smoothly made my way to my dad's office. While he was in a meeting, I skillfully removed the listening device from under his desk. The next day, I didn't go to the office or return home. Instead, I went to a hotel. I took 2 days to liquidate all my mom's stocks. On the 5th day, Aunt Pamela withdrew her investment. My dad's company was suddenly plunged into crisis. He started frantically calling and texting me. He reminisced about my childhood and sent me a photo of us having a picnic together. In the photo, my dad was kissing my face, and we appeared inseparable. But my dad forgot that my mom was the one who took that picture. Looking at the photo, I could only think of my mom. I thought if my mom could meet a Reagan that belonged to her, maybe she wouldn't have died back then. But unfortunately, there are no maybes in this world. Only regrets. I sighed and took the listening device, beginning to organize all the audio recordings of my dad from both the company and home. I selected the most important segments and posted them online. The next day, his company made the news. Group president exposed for tax evasion, illegal fundraising, and bribery became the hot search topic of the day. The stock plummeted, and shareholders demanded an explanation from my dad. He was falling apart. He sent me a text, "You treat your father this way, aren't you afraid of retribution?" I smiled and replied, "You're not afraid of retribution, so why should I be? Does God really let someone like you, who drives his wife to death and harms his friends, go unpunished while punishing me? Isn't that right, my dear dad?" Fearing my dad wouldn't understand, I added, "By the way, Tim sends his regards from another world, Dad." My dad didn't reply. But typing showed on his side for a long time, and finally, he sent a few words. "How do you know Tim?" How did I know? I looked down, gently touching my slightly rounded belly, a smile forming on my lips. He is my child's grandfather, after all. He is Reagan's father, a cultured and refined man who was betrayed by friends and killed over his patent. My dad was arrested. My stepmother was also implicated and arrested. The company could no longer hold on and declared bankruptcy, with all our real estate used to pay off debts. My pregnant sister was kicked out of the villa and tearfully sought out Lyndon. But Lyndon only gave her money to stay in a hotel. He didn't even let her stay in his house. He called me, "Ingrid, I know it must be really tough for you right now. Don't be scared, I'll handle it." At that moment, I was having tea with Lyndon's biggest competitor. I had a stack of documents in my hand, containing all of Lyndon's business secrets and lifelines. When I received his call, I smiled with my eyes squinted and thanked him. I was very happy, thank you. Just take care of yourself for now. 3 days later, a major deal for Lyndon was intercepted. A week later, Lyndon's biggest partner was poached. 3 months later, Lyndon was besieged by several competitors, and some shady news about his business leaked, causing a stir. The bank began to stop lending to Lyndon. Lyndon was on a fast downward spiral. Lyndon could no longer pay attention to me. One late night, he called me, his voice full of fatigue. "Natalie has given birth." I paused for a moment and replied, "Congratulations." Memories seemed to drift back to that afternoon. The afternoon when Lyndon announced to me that Natalie was pregnant and wanted me to be the hostage. But the pain from back then was gone, replaced by a sense of luck. I was lucky to have been a hostage for Natalie, and Natalie had given Lyndon a child for me. I was lucky that my child belonged to Reagan. Lyndon seemed to be smoking. I heard the sound of him exhaling smoke. "I've figured it out, Ingrid," he said. "The only person capable of bugging both your home and your father's company, and ruthless enough to go after him, is you. And every single business secret leaked from my company was something you overheard. All of this was your plan." I sipped my tea and smiled, replying playfully, "So what?" Lyndon didn't say a word. His breathing was tense. After a moment, he coughed, and then with a bitter smile, asked, "Ingrid, if I keep the child and let Natalie go, would you come back?" Even though I was long desensitized to him, his words still made me feel disgusted. "Are you seriously considering keeping the child and ditching the mother?" Lyndon's voice trembled. "Ingrid, whether you believe it or not, even knowing what you've done, I still want you. I regret it. I regret getting Natalie pregnant, and I regret sending you as a hostage and letting that man take you." His voice grew low, filled with frustration and regret. "Now that your dad and stepmom have been arrested, and my company's on the brink of collapse, Ingrid, you must be satisfied by now. I'll make Natalie leave, and we can start over. Isn't that enough to make up for everything?" I swallowed the tea in my mouth and gazed out the window at the city lights. Just one more year until Reagan gets out. Then, Reagan and I will have a home here, with a warm light of our own in this city. Feeling hopeful about the future, my mood lightened. I smiled and said to Lyndon, word by word, "But Mr. Lyndon, you're not even worthy to shine my lover's shoes. You belong with someone like Natalie." I hung up the phone and stood by the window, taking a long, deep breath. All the grudges end here. From now on, my life is with Reagan. A year later, 2 major things happened. My daughter was born, and Reagan was released from prison. When my daughter was born, Lyndon got the news. After my family villa was auctioned, I bought it back and had it redesigned in the style my mother originally envisioned. Now, it's home for me and my daughter. As I was holding my daughter and getting out of the car, I saw Lyndon's car parked nearby. His company had taken a huge hit, and now he was starting over from scratch. He was no longer the powerful man he once was, and he looked much more haggard. But he still had some ability, and slowly, his company was beginning to recover. My sister had given birth to his child, but she didn't get the marriage she hoped for. She constantly pressured Lyndon to marry her, but he never agreed. The strain of this made her lose her softness, and they argued endlessly, with the baby often crying in the background. Lyndon spent his days trying to save his company and his nights locked in battles with my sister. When I saw him again, he looked much more worn out. Seeing the baby in my arms, his eyes dimmed, and he forced a bitter smile. "Even though he was in prison, you still had a child with him." He lowered his head. "I guess I finally believe you truly love him." In a rush to get my daughter home, I simply replied, "Yeah, that's right." Lyndon smiled again, but this time, it was filled with a sadness and a sense of loss. Just as I was about to close the door, he suddenly asked, as if to me, or maybe to himself, if I hadn't been obsessed with the thrill of something new, would this child have been ours? I shook my head. Lyndon, there are no what-ifs in this world, only paths you can't go back down. I thought for a moment, then added, but I am thankful you chose Natalie. Otherwise, how could I have met the love of my life? That man who, like a light, illuminated my darkest moments. When everything settled, I was filled with gratitude for fate. Grateful that life had brought me to the person I was truly meant to be with. Lyndon swayed, his face turning pale. After a while, he smiled, though it was forced. I'm glad to hear that. I won't bother you anymore. I wish you happiness for the rest of your life. He turned and walked away, his figure looking lonely in the sunset. Goodbye. Watching him leave, I suddenly remembered our childhood. A little Lyndon once raised his hand and made a promise to a little me. I, Lyndon, will always be good to Ingrid. If I don't, let me be lonely for the rest of my life. Who could have known back then that promises were just a kind of joke? I sighed, cradling my daughter as I went back home. My dad and stepmother were sentenced to prison, and my sister and Lyndon had grown to resent each other. All the past grudges had finally come to an end. Next month, Reagan would be released. 1 month later, I took my daughter to pick up Reagan. Reagan held our daughter in his arms, gave me a wink, as if he was about to smile. But in the next second, he suddenly burst into tears, crying uncontrollably as he hugged us tightly. I hugged him back, my tears soaking into his shoulder. Now, I finally had a home again. Reagan's side story. My name is Reagan, and I grew up on the streets. People always said I was ruthless, but they don't know that if I hadn't been, I would have died at 9, during a standoff over a piece of bread. Being ruthless made me the king of the streets. Being ruthless helped me survive countless near-death situations in my mercenary life. And being ruthless turned me from a lone mercenary into one of the top leaders of a mercenary group. At 26, I finally made it, standing firm in this world. I watched the news, looking at the man who caused my father's death, now a respected CEO. It was time for me to go back and get my revenge. When I returned, I met up with an old friend from the streets. He hadn't made it out and was still doing shady jobs. Recently, he took on a strange gig, posing as a kidnapper for some rich girl. Apparently, this girl seduced her brother-in-law and got pregnant, but the guy refused to go public. So, she came up with this plan to test his feelings. I looked at the name of the client and raised an eyebrow. Well, this should be fun. It was the daughter of my enemy. I grabbed a toy gun, it was all I needed for a group who'd never seen real combat. I watched coldly as the rich man stood between his 2 pampered daughters, looking at the cheating man caught in the middle. It was amusing. While they were playing games, I had been fighting for my life. The stark contrast in our fates was thanks to their ungrateful father. I felt no sympathy for any of them. Especially that man, engaged to the sister but sleeping with the younger one, and to protect his unborn child, he pushed his fiancé into harm's way. But the older sister was still clueless. Even now, she was asking whose child it was. I couldn't help but laugh, chiming in, even I can see who the father is. She froze, her eyes dark and full of pain. As she watched him walk away with her sister, the light in her eyes dimmed. The sunset's dying rays reflected her despair. In that moment, I felt my heart skip a beat. I remembered when my father died and my mother left me, standing alone in the sunset, consumed by despair, but biting my lip to keep from trembling. I also recalled what I had discovered in my investigation. 2 years after stealing my father's patent, the man had found a mistress and had an illegitimate child. Once he became rich, he brought his mistress and child into his home, driving his wife to her death. And he left behind a daughter that no one cared for. I looked at the girl in front of me, drowning in despair, and felt my heart beat loudly in my chest. I decided to give her a choice. She could choose to numb herself to everything and endure it, becoming the unlucky pawn sacrificed by her family. If she chose that, I wouldn't hold back. Or, she could choose to turn against her family, fighting for justice for herself and her mother. If she did that, I wouldn't mind teaching her how to be decisive, brave, and resilient. I told her to think for herself, whether she wanted to live to seek revenge or keep swallowing her pride. She thought about it all night. That night, I was unusually uneasy. To be honest, I was afraid she'd choose to stand against me. When she came to me the next day, I didn't even want to hear her answer. But thank God, she chose to make those villains pay for what they did. So, my plan changed. I no longer intended to take action myself. I let the enemy's own daughter do it. I wanted his biological daughter to send him to prison. I began training this quiet, fragile girl. We started with her physical strength. Once her body was strong, her spirit wouldn't be weak. It seemed she was holding in a lot of anger, pushing herself to the limit, training with me like her life depended on it. In less than 6 months, her combat skills and tracking abilities had surpassed most ordinary people. She could now hunt without emotion, kill her prey, and let blood splatter across her face without flinching. I've always believed that hate changes a person more than love ever could. In my spare moments, I found myself staring at her, lost in thought. There were times I no longer wanted to return to the mercenary group, even though that's where I built my reputation. Some days, she appeared in my dreams, wearing a bride's white dress, smiling at me. When I woke, I could clearly hear a voice in my head saying, "Reagan, you're done for, you've fallen for her." But there was another voice telling me, "Reagan, you're a mercenary who grew up on the streets. What right do you have to want someone as beautiful as her?" Every day, I was torn between these two voices, growing anxious, even starting to avoid her. But I realized I couldn't escape. Even the sound of her crying in her sleep made me jump out of bed and rush to her, holding her tightly, my heart aching for her. What kind of pain had my girl been through? When she woke up in my arms, her tear-filled eyes stared straight at me, filled with trust and an unspoken emotion that pierced through my heart. I can't say who made the first move, but we kissed each other at the same time. From that day on, I had a home. I had someone to love. I started thinking about how I could stay by my girl's side in a way that was open and honest. I wrapped up my business over there and transferred a decent sum of money back home. Then I turned myself in. I hadn't hurt anyone during the kidnapping, and we returned the ransom to Lyndon. Ingrid insisted it had just been a prank that we planned together. The lawyer I hired was good, and in the end, I was sentenced to just 1 year. After a year, I would be able to walk in the sunlight, hand in hand with my girl for the rest of our lives. During that year, I let her go and take her revenge. Still, I had 2 of my men secretly protect her. But to my pride, she never needed their help. On her own, she avenged everything. The year passed quickly, and on the day I was released, Ingrid stood waiting for me at the prison gates. She was wearing a simple sky blue dress, her face bare, her long hair falling over her shoulders. In her arms, she held a baby with big, bright eyes staring curiously at me. When she saw me, Ingrid handed the baby to me and said, "Your daughter." It's hard to describe what I felt at that moment. I was only in my 20s, but I'd been rolling through blood and war for over a decade, with my life hanging by a thread every day. I never dared to dream of having a family. I didn't even dare think of my dead family, afraid the memory would cloud my vision with tears, blurring the bullets and shrapnel ahead of me. But that day, under the blue sky, white clouds, and warm sunshine, the girl I loved held our daughter, smiling at me like all the suffering we'd been through was just a dream. When the dream ended, all that remained was peace and sweetness. I'd shed blood before, but I had never shed tears. Yet at that moment, my tears fell onto my daughter's face. With one arm around Ingrid and the other holding my daughter, I walked toward the sunlight that belonged to us. After all the twists and turns, life had finally given me something sweet, hadn't it? The end.